You're listening to School Counseling Simplified, a podcast with easy-to-implement strategies for busy school counselors. Here's your host, Rachel Davis from Bright Futures Counseling.
Let's play a little game of Would You Rather, School Counselor Edition. Okay, would you rather spend your weekend planning a group or spend your afternoon sitting in irrelevant PD? Yikes. Or would you rather be the only counselor with no one to collaborate with, or to spend hours searching online for engaging activities? All of these options are pretty bad, right? But unfortunately, they're all too real. But what if I told you I had a solution for you? What if I told you I had access to hundreds of school counseling lessons, groups, and activities, counselor-specific trainings on the topics you need most, and a community of like-minded school counselors to support you? You would say, yes, please. Well, that is what Impact is all about. Impact is my monthly membership for school counselors, and it helps you with all of these things. You get access to hundreds of resources. That's unlimited free downloads. Log in and get what you need right away to every single resource that's in my store. We add new resources each and every month. We're adding a new middle school and elementary resource each month, and some of these are bonus Impact exclusives, meaning that you can get resources just for members. You can request resources that you need and easily search so you can find exactly what you're looking for. And let's talk about the trainings, counselor-specific trainings on the topics you need most. We do these each and every month as part of our Coffee with the Counselor series. Impact members get to join for absolutely free. You earn PD certificates and you get exclusive access to members-only things like the Ultimate Small Group Experience and our Summer Summit Conference. And the community. Y'all, this is possibly my favorite part of Impact. I so look forward to jumping on these calls, to getting to know counselors who are similar to me and also completely different. It's so fun to hear from your experiences and your challenges, and everyone brings a unique perspective to the table. We have an exclusive online community, and we even have a cool app where you can chat with other counselors in these community circles. We have our monthly calls, like I mentioned, twice a month, and we share wins, troubleshoot tough cases, and just talk about what it's like to be a counselor, because so often we're on our own island at our school sites. So if any of that sounds like it's for you, I would love to see you inside Impact. Go to stressfreeschoolcounseling.com/impact to solve all of your counselor problems. And I have a special offer for my listeners. Use code POD at checkout to save 10% off your first month. Okay, let's go to today's episode. Hey there, thanks for listening to another episode of School Counseling Simplified. Today I have on an awesome guest. I interview Sophia from School Psych Finds. She is a school psychologist who is super passionate and knowledgeable about anxiety. I learned so much from this episode. She was such a treat to interview. You can just tell that she is an expert in this subject, and I was so happy to have her on the podcast. We talk all things anxiety. We dive deep into some CBT strategies that counselors can implement in the school setting, along with little deep dives on selective mutism and school avoidance. I think you're going to love this episode with Sophia. Like I said, she was really knowledgeable, and just I learned so much in our short time together, and I hope you do too. Okay, let's go to the show. Hi, Sophia. How are you today?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm great. I'm very excited to have you on with us today. We were just chatting a little off air about how you have a podcast too.
Yeah, it's called the School Psych Finds podcast.
Oh, awesome. Very cool. So yes, you are a school psychologist or former school psychologist, and I'm so excited to hear your opinions and advice for us when it comes to helping students who are struggling with anxiety. My audience is mostly school counselors, and they're listening to the podcast, on their way to work or to hear on their lunch break, maybe just the ways that they can help support their students. So cannot wait to chat with you today. But tell us a little bit about who you are and your background.
I'm Sophia. I'm a school psychologist by training, and I've worked in all different kinds of settings from preschool through high school and continuation school. I recently gave birth to my son, so I'm currently a stay-at-home mom with him, but I have lots of experience working with children and families in all different kinds of settings, and anxiety is one of my passion topics, so I'm so excited that you asked me to come on to talk about that.
Amazing. Yes, I found you on Instagram, and I was like, okay, we have to have her on the pod to talk about this. Who's ready for our monthly coffee date? In this month's Coffee with the Counselor training, I'll be sharing Mindfulness Matters, how to use neuroscience-based strategies in counseling. Y'all, I am fired up about this topic, and I cannot wait to share with you the latest research findings. Coffee with the Counselor is my monthly live training series where I offer counselor specific PD for the price of your daily Starbucks run. This one will be on March 26th at 6 p.m. Eastern. If you want to learn more about mindfulness and how you can use it in your school counseling program, you don't want to miss this. Save your seat at stressfreeschoolcounseling.com/coffee. All right, let's go back to the show.
Most recently, I was in a high school for a few years. I really enjoyed that because, as I said, anxiety is like one of my areas that I really like. I like social emotional stuff. And I feel like at the high school level, you get to do a lot more counseling in kind of like that traditional sense. But I
Mm-hmm.
loved working with elementary school kids too. And I think that's where like the bulk of my years of experience was. And I know that there's a lot of anxiety that happens there too, even though people outside of the school setting are often surprised to hear that even elementary school kids struggle with anxiety.
Yes, that's such a good point. And it's kind of funny. I feel like it's the inverse for counselors because at the high school level, we're doing a lot more of like scheduling type tasks and less of the social emotional. And then in elementary, we usually get to do more social emotional. But it sounds like
Right.
probably, I'm
Yeah,
guessing,
that's true.
yeah, because I've worked with a school psychologist. I used to share an office with one at the elementary school, and she wanted to be doing more social emotional, but had to do a lot of like the testing and everything. But I guess
Yep.
there's less
And
of that in
it's
high
so
school.
different depending on the school you're at, the setting you're at, what kind of practitioner you are. But I've loved working with school counselors. Like, I think it's such a great team, the counselor and the psychologist at school, to kind of like work with each other and like help support families because there's certainly not enough of us for all of the families that there are, whether
Yes.
it's counselors or psychologists. We need more of us.
I agree. And school social workers, everybody.
Yeah,
Let's dive in. And can you please tell us some of the anxiety strategies that you love to use with kids? And you can
sure.
share these across ages, like little guys, high school, whatever.
Okay, yeah. I would say one of my main working principles that and one of the most evidence-based ways to approach anxiety is through cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT. And I know that can sound really intimidating for a lot of people. You don't obviously have to be like have a psychology degree or license to be able to pull from evidence-based strategies of CBT. And there's lots of curriculums that pull from that and different strategies. So I can talk about that, but I think in terms of like how to approach things, my first recommendation for any practitioner at school would be to try to identify what is the kind of anxiety that that student is exhibiting, because we know there's so many different kinds of anxiety. And really to effectively support that student, we need to understand like, is it separation anxiety, which often comes up at the elementary school level, especially at the start of the year? Is it social anxiety? So a lot of students also have general anxiety, but really trying to figure out what is it exactly that we want to work on. And in order to do that, I highly recommend talking to a bunch of different people. So, like the parents, the teacher, but most importantly, the student themselves. And I feel like at the elementary level, that often gets left out because there's so little. We think like, oh, we need to, talk to the adults to figure this out. But it's so important to have an interview with the student and really try to help them, even them, figure out like, well, what is it that's causing you to feel like this worry? Like, why don't you want to come to school? Or what goes through your mind when you're taking this test? Things like that. And then the strategy that I think is extremely important at any level, but again, especially at the elementary school level, is for them to be able to even identify the emotion that they're feeling. So I really like to take it all the way to the beginning before we dive into like teaching them the skills, because they have to know when to use that skill. And in order to know that, they need to know that they're experiencing anxiety. And actually, research shows that even just being able to identify that you're feeling an emotion and naming it can help you feel like it's more manageable.
I love that. Name it to tame it.
Yes. So you read The Whole Brain Child too.
Yes, yes. No, I love that. That I'm just nodding my head the whole time with everything you're saying. I think that's so important. A lot of times I know as counselors, we're like constantly doing the emotional recognition stuff. So you may think that everyone knows, like, okay, they already know the feelings. I don't want to do another feelings lesson, but it's so necessary and such like the starting point before you can dive deeper, right?
And there's so much you can do because that sounds like such a simple thing. Like, okay, child, you're feeling anxiety. And they're like, yes, I know. But there's so many things you can do to help them identify what they're feeling and the level which they're feeling it. So, okay, yes, you're experiencing anxiety, but what happens in your body? How do you know when you're experiencing anxiety? And even things like a feelings thermometer or a scale, like, well, what level are we at? And if it's things like a specific phobia, you can help them break down the anxiety there as well. Like, okay, well, what causes you the most anxiety? Oh, okay, so being in the classroom causes you the most anxiety on a scale of like 1 to 10. Where's like getting in the car to come to school on
Mm.
that scale of 1 to 10? Where's like when you come to the building? Because especially at the beginning of the year, a lot of students kind of need that breakdown if they're avoiding school when we get to school avoidance, which is another really challenging thing to work on with students. But it comes up a lot across settings, especially after COVID, working in the high school setting. It was really surprising to see that we had tons of high school students that could not come to school. And even years later, still experiencing that distress when trying to make it to class because the anxiety is so strong.
Mm. So I love that. Let's break that down, like what the next step would be. So if we're asking the kids, okay, school avoidance, let's talk about like the level that you are in the car, and then the level that you are when we're at the front door, and then the level that you are when you're entering the building. Um, After they identify those different levels, what would the next step then be?
So we would talk about like what feels manageable to them. And this is a process kind of that you want to make sure you're doing in collaboration with everyone else, not just you and the student, but you have to have the parents on board, you have to have teacher on board. And ideally, if it's to a significant level, you would hope that the student is also receiving private therapy. And one of my biggest recommendations for any practitioner at school is to collaborate and consult and talk with private practitioners that the student is seeing. I know it's hard, like it's hard to take the time to do that. Sometimes it's hard to reach them. Sometimes we're trying, they're not getting back to us. But if you can, working in collaboration with their private providers is extremely important, especially when we're talking about anxiety, so that everyone in that student's life is on the same page. So anyways, and the reason I bring that up is because basically what we're doing, not in a therapeutic sense, but is a like mini version of exposure therapy with that.
Mhm.
Because we know that with anxiety, avoiding your fears actually increases them. And when it comes to separation anxiety and school anxiety, children and parents and school staff often have the tendency to be like, okay, well, you're just having a hard time. Let's go home, right? Oh, stay home today. And sometimes I understand that's appropriate, but most of the time you really want to try as much as possible to keep the student in school and come to school, even if it's hard for them, because the more they avoid it, the more their anxiety will increase. So you want to talk to the student depending on where their school anxiety level is at to figure out like what feels manageable and take it step by step. So, okay, maybe being in the classroom all day seems like way too much. How about if the first step for tomorrow is you just come to my office, the school counselor's office, and you meet me here. Again, school avoidance is one of the trickiest things to work on in terms of anxiety because it takes a lot of one-on-one work and support with everyone. And it takes a while because, as you can see, there are all these little steps to
Mhm.
eventually get to the overall goal of reintegrating into the classroom full time. And I have done this with students and it is successful, but it does take time and it takes a lot of resources as well.
Right. Oh my gosh, this is great. So I feel like that was just one small thing, but it is so helpful. Yes, I love that. Now let's go back to those CBT strategies. What else do you recommend, or what are like some of
Sure.
your?
So again, CBT sounds kind of intimidating, but really all it is, I'm sure, like, have you heard of thinking traps or cognitive distortions?
Mhm.
Things like that, right? And CBT is really this basic idea that your thoughts, emotions, and behaviors are all interconnected, right? You can think of it as like a triangle. And the premise behind it is that before you have an emotion, you have a thought that you may or may not be aware of. And that causes you to have an emotion. And then that causes you to have a behavior. And it's a vicious circle if they're negative thoughts and negative emotions. If you can change your thoughts, then you can change your emotions and you can change your behavior. And so thinking traps are one of the best ways to work on students with this. And even just starting with helping them, again, just identify and understand that those exist. So one of the most common ones that people have probably heard of is black and white thinking or all or nothing thinking, right? So if we go back to the example of school anxiety and school avoidance, the thought that I either go to school every single day and stay there all day or I don't go at all. Well, that's a cognitive distortion, right? Because you could go to school for 30 minutes. Obviously, we want them there full time, but when we're working with severe school avoidance, we're going to get what we can take and slowly increase that. You'll see more success with that than trying to expect perfection from the student.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like it's
Yeah.
something where you could celebrate their wins too. Like, oh, you were here for 30 minutes. That's so awesome. And as a
Yes.
motivator.
And I think as the mental health professionals at school, it's our job to help the people in their lives understand that that is a celebration, even though for the adults, it feels disappointing. It feels like a loss because the idea is you're supposed to be at school all day, every day, full time. But for a student that's working with severe school avoidance, the 30 minutes might have been really difficult for them. And for them, maybe coming to school feels like what it would feel like to an adult to be standing in front of a lion. Right. And so standing in
Yeah.
front of a lion for 30 minutes, wow, if you're really afraid of that, like that's a big deal. Or if you're really afraid of heights, standing on the edge of a cliff for 30 minutes, whoa. Right. So, also, the biggest thing we can do for students with anxiety is also to help the adults in their lives around them understand how to support them so that the students are successful and don't instead feel ridiculed or dismissed from their feelings.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I love that. That's so good. Yeah, just getting, I mean, it sounds like we have to get the whole team on board here, right? Which, as you mentioned, and I like that you mentioned that you were like, it's not always easy to like get in touch with the, professional counselor they're seeing, or even parents are hard to get in touch with, or teachers. And you have to think like the teachers have 30 kids, so they may be having multiple kids experiencing different things like this. But the team approach really is necessary, for success.
Yeah, especially if you're talking about a school-based phobia and
Mhm.
school avoidance. But really, anxiety is something that takes work from all the people in their lives. But if it's something different, more like, test-specific anxiety or selective mutism, which a lot of people don't know, selective mutism is actually a type of anxiety, then that can maybe take a little less intensive collaboration with everyone, but that's still my recommendation for any kind of anxiety is as much as possible work with all the stakeholders. And
Mhm.
again, I know that we're talking about like ideal versus reality, and it's not always possible to do that, but just should try your best to do that when you can. You'll see a lot more success.
Right. Can we talk about selective mutism? Because I had a student, I think about her all the time. It's when I was first starting out, and I just felt so ill-equipped to help her. And then she ended up like leaving schools, and it was just one of my like counselor fails that like still sits with me.
Oh,
But I feel like I could never help her. So I would love to hear your recommendations for that in case another counselor is struggling.
yeah, of course. I think that's another thing that while it's pretty common in the like overall population of students, you usually probably only have like a handful every year who are really displaying like significant selective mutism. So it's hard to know what to do with them. And a lot of people, especially people who aren't trained in mental health, don't know that it's an anxiety-based disorder. So they don't understand. And so you have teachers and parents getting really frustrated because why, you speak at home with me, why won't you speak at school, or vice versa, whatever it is. Because with selective mutism, it's usually a specific environment that the student doesn't feel comfortable speaking in because of their anxiety. And I think, again, the biggest thing is to help the people in their lives realize that they're not doing it to be defiant. They're not doing it to be disrespectful. They're doing it because they're so anxious that they're freezing up and they can't speak, or it's too scary for them to speak. So, in the school setting, my biggest recommendation actually is first and foremost to go forward with accommodations. And I'm not saying that has to be formal accommodation through like a 504. Sometimes it needs to be, but other times it can be informal. And I think that's the best place to start. So, not forcing the student to speak verbally is actually extremely important in the beginning. So, the recommendations would be to the teacher, like maybe don't cold call on them. Don't force them to speak. Have alternative methods for them to communicate with you. So whether that's like writing or being able to, raise their hand a certain way to say yes, or a card, things like that, ways that they can communicate that are nonverbal. And usually writing is the best and easiest way.
I love that. Yeah, that's so good. And I love that you mentioned that the accommodations don't have to be formal because sometimes that can just feel like one more barrier, like, paperwork or whatever to get through.
Yeah, and I think that's something as school psychologists, we work a lot in the IEP world and evaluating students, as you're
Mhm.
aware. We also oftentimes work with 504s. And just because those, especially for 504s, just because that's not set into place doesn't mean we can't start offering accommodations to see if they even need those or if they're beneficial.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of a good way to test it out.
Yeah.
Another thing I wanted to ask you about was preventative strategies. So,
Mm.
as counselors, we do a lot of tier one, like classroom lessons, where we're teaching coping skills, self-regulation, emotional identification, things like that. What about anxiety in a tier one preventative sense?
I love that question because I think that for any kind of mental health issues that arise, and especially anxiety, the best time to teach the strategies are preventatively or when the student is not in crisis. And again, that's so hard to do in the school
Mhm.
because our resources are so limited. So I love that counselors are able to go into the classroom and, like, on a wide scale, start teaching kind of these baseline coping skills and identifying your emotions. Because we know that when students are in crisis, when humans are in crisis, they're not really able to think logically and learn well. So you actually want to teach them when they're calm.
Right.
And so anything I would actually say, and I know this maybe sounds a little bit silly, but anything that you would teach that is research based to a student with anxiety when you're actually working with them, I would recommend teaching that preventatively on a whole scale level. So, mindfulness is a really good evidence based technique to teach to students. And again, this all goes back to just being able to identify how you're feeling. What are you feeling in your body? And identifying it in a way that is non-judgmental. So not like, oh my gosh, I'm going to fail this test and I'm freaking out, but oh, my heart is racing. I'm feeling sweaty. I can't really think clearly. I'm feeling anxious, right? And then identifying, well, what is it that I'm feeling anxious about? What are the thoughts that I'm having? I think teaching these basic principles of mindfulness, of thinking traps and thinking errors, I think the feelings thermometer, especially at a younger age, is a really good strategy for students to learn, because then you can teach them, okay, when on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being I feel great, I'm calm, I'm happy, and 5 being I'm completely out of control and dysregulated. What can I do when I'm at each level, right?
Mhm.
When do I need to ask an adult for help? And I think that's another great strategy for schools to have, is a safe place and a safe person that the student can identify at school. And oftentimes that's going to be the counselor, the social worker, the psychologist. And so
Mhm.
how can they ask for that? Right? So a student with selective mutism is not going to go up to their teacher and be like, I need to go talk to the school counselor. So is there something like, have you heard of a flash pass? I'm not sure if that's a common term across.
No.
Okay. But basically it's just a little card that the student can, like, show the teacher to be like, I need to talk to someone. And there's no questions asked about it. So obviously you want to use discretion when you're giving this to students, like who actually needs this. And you want to set boundaries and explain to them how to use it. But it's a way where when they're feeling dysregulated, instead of running out of the classroom and leaving or completely melting down and shutting down, they know that they have a safe place in person that they're going to be able to go to, or at least, go to their office or the front office to wait for them.
Yeah, I love that. The flash pass. That's a great idea. And yeah, again, it's just giving the child more control, because I feel like anxiety is so often tied to this like loss of control feeling. So kind of like we were saying earlier, by naming the emotion, just by simply recognizing it and naming it, we start to feel more in control, right? So I think having that pass has got to feel really good for the kids, even if they don't need to use it, just knowing that they have that option.
So many students actually felt safer just knowing, like you said, that they had that option, because you're completely right. One of the biggest things about anxiety is a loss of control. It's also a loss of knowing what to expect and predictability. So having a plan with that student of, like, what can you do when these things happen? What will you do when these things happen can really help calm them, because the biggest thing for anxiety is feeling like you're going to be able to cope with something when it happens. Right. And so knowing, like, okay, if I get into the classroom and I feel like I just can't handle this anymore, I know that I can just show this past to my teacher and I'm going to get help.
Hmm.
versus how scary if you have anxiety to think, okay, the teacher's teaching and I need to find a way to raise my hand. And how do I put my words together to say I need help and not embarrass myself and not let
Right.
everyone else know what's going on, right? To everyone else, it can just look like they're going to the bathroom. So
Hmm.
having a plan is super important, and having, in terms of the home setting, like routines and consistency. Reading social stories are really good for students with anxiety because, again, it gives them examples and predictability of like how things could happen.
Hmm. Oh, I love this. This is all so helpful. I'm just so glad I'm interviewing you. The other thing I wanted to ask about, and we've talked about the team aspect a bit, getting everyone on board, but how can counselors support families, especially families who maybe aren't, are less involved or are very busy, working, multiple children? How can we have an easy way to give parents and caregivers strategies to help support their students at home?
There's a couple things, but one of the biggest things is, again, validating their child's emotions. And that doesn't mean that you agree with them or that you're empowering those emotions, right? So your child is scared to go to school or scared to go to soccer practice. You don't say, "Oh my God, yeah, that's so scary. What if X, Y, and Z happens?" Right? Or, "Oh yeah, you're so right." No, you say, "Oh, I hear that you're scared. You sound really scared about going to soccer. You're like you're wondering what's going to happen." Just letting them feel heard and not ridiculed, because oftentimes when children experience anxiety, especially significant enough where it comes to our attention as mental health professionals at school, it's impacting the family in negative ways. It's making it harder for parents who, like you said, oftentimes are already so busy, are up to their capacity, and then the child just won't go to school, and it leaves them feeling really frustrated and saying things like, "Why won't you just go to school? Why can't you just do what you're supposed to do? It's not that hard," right? Things like that that don't actually help the student overcome or manage their anxiety. It makes it worse. It makes them feel like a burden. So I think the most important thing for parents to understand is that they have to have patience. They have to understand this is going to take time. And I know that's hard and that sucks to hear, but if we want to get through this, like we have to put these principles into practice. And if the parents are don't have the time really to work with the children at home on these strategies, trying to connect them with community resources for therapy, or if your area has like free resources for therapy as well. Sometimes those are possible. They are hard to come by. But that is really helpful because then the student is going to get a lot more support. Obviously, there's only so much we can do within the school setting. And there's also a limited amount that we want to do, not only in terms of our resources, but because the student is missing educational time when they're with us. And
Hmm.
even if it's, during recess, during lunch, like those are still educational moments that they are missing, whether, social skills with their peers, building friendships. And that doesn't mean that what we do isn't important. It's very important. And sometimes it is necessary for them to miss, some of math class or some of lunchtime with their friends to learn skills with us. But I think outside therapy is also extremely important when we're talking about significant anxiety.
Yes, definitely. Oh, thank you. That's like I said, this has just been so helpful. I know I'm having so many takeaways, so I'm sure the listeners are too. Any final thoughts that you want to share with us when it comes to supporting students with anxiety?
Have you heard of the website called Therapist Aid?
No.
Okay, so now I'm going to change your life and anyone else who's listening. And this is
Love
not
it.
sponsored. Yep, I love them so much. I've used them so much. This is a website. I've never even, I don't think, spoken to the person who's behind it. I don't know who's behind it. But it is a website with tons of free resources for mental health providers to use with students and children and for of all ages, and it sorts things out beautifully. It's super accessible and it has worksheets that are super easy to grab and go and use and read with the student, because I know we're all short on time. And
Mhm.
the last thing we have time to do is try to create our own resources like for every different student. And it has stuff specifically for anxiety. It has stuff about thinking traps. It has stuff about distress tolerance, like anything really you'd like to do with students, you're probably going to find it there. And again, it's like super easy explanations on one page where you can just print it out, sit with the student, and do it together. And they're evidence-based strategies.
Oh, how amazing. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, we will link to that in the show notes for sure. Yeah, that's so nice to just have something free, accessible, easy to implement. Thank you. And tell us, what about you? Where can we connect with you? Or do you have any like podcast episodes that are a good starting place for counselors specifically?
I think my podcast has taken a back seat at the moment just from being a mom. My son's almost a year old. I'm hoping to get it running back up regularly. The only one I think that would be really targeted that school counselors would also benefit from is the counseling in public schools episode, because I talk a lot about when we do counseling in public schools and the difference between therapy and counseling. Because as you know, we don't do therapy in schools, but we do counseling. It's a lot of crazy semantics, right? So I try to
Right,
break
right.
that down for people in
Okay.
that episode. And then if school counselors are interested in learning more about any of the IEP related disabilities, I do have episodes on that as well. So that's called the School Psych Finds podcast. I have it on YouTube and any major podcast platform. And then if you're looking for school-based psychology stuff, I have a Instagram called School Psych Finds. And if you're looking for motherhood and child development stuff, I have a Instagram called School Psych Mom.
I love that. I love that you've done the pivot as your life has pivoted with your new baby. Congratulations.
Thank
Your
you.
business baby and your real baby. That's cool.
Oh,
But yeah, maybe we'll have you back on for an episode to talk about the mom and child development piece of it, because I would
I
love
would love
that.
that.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, Sophia. This has been really awesome. And we will link to everything that you mentioned in the show notes.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Hey there, thanks for listening to this episode. I hope you loved the interview with Sophia as much as I did. As you know, this month we're doing Coffee with the Counselor. This is my training for counselors, and this month's topic is Mindfulness Matters, how to use neuroscience-based strategies in counseling. As you heard Sophia mention in the interview, mindfulness is an evidence-based exercise and practice that can really help your students who are struggling with anxiety. This Coffee with the Counselor training goes hand in hand with what we've been talking about on the podcast, and I really think you're going to love it. It is free for Impact members, $10 for everyone else. Go to stressfreeschoolcounseling.com/coffee to save your seat. That's going to be on March 26th at 6 p.m. Eastern, but even if you're not available, you can still sign up, and then you'll get the replay and everything. Okay, guys, thank you so much. I'll talk to y'all next week.
Thanks for listening to School Counseling Simplified. You can find the links from today's episode in the show notes. If you'd like to connect with Rachel, she's on Instagram and Teachers Pay Teachers at Bright Futures Counseling. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss any episodes of School Counseling Simplified. Talk to you next week.